Is there something happening kind of neurochemically in the brain, specifically around anorexia when they do, because essentially what's happening is you're starving your body, right? Is there something that happens in the brain that makes you feel good? Or is it that when you do eat, because your body's not used to it, you just feel really bad?
Well, it's really interesting because when you go into restriction, for example, your brain enters a sort of threat mode essentially. So it puts you on high alert. And so your anxiety actually increases initially because, your brain is kind of going, need to eat, need to eat, need to eat. It's mission control, it needs to be fed. And it's a hungry organ. It takes a lot of calories out of your body. So often what you see is people becoming more anxious and more rigid initially and becoming more preoccupied. You get what's called sort of reduced prefrontal cortex activity. So your decision making, your flexibility literally goes offline. And when you have increased anxiety and stress, the cortex floods with cortisol, which the whole thing becomes like, very ineffective in terms of how it operates. So the sort of obsession then with food becomes a survival response. You know,
Right.
we need to eat to live, but that sort of survival response almost kind of becomes quite distorted. So in an anorexic brain, what happens is rather than, if I'm hungry, my brain will start to signal to me around lunchtime, look, it's time to have something to eat, and then I'll start to think about creating some space to go and eat. When that signal comes into an anorexic's brain, then what they start to think is it's a threat, right? So it's time to eat. So I now need to start to engage in the behaviors that help me to minimize that need to eat. So then the behavioral patterns start to shift. I might take myself for a walk. I might start to drink water. I might eat chewing gum. I might look at other ways to fill. I might absorb myself in a piece of work. I'll do whatever I can to disconnect from that feeling of hunger. I will avoid the feeling of hunger. And that's the sort of difficulty then when you're starting to sort of look at the behavioral shifts that need to happen. Because as you say, when I then eat something, I go into a whole different set of terror, which is I can then feel that food inside of my body. And I might use different behaviors. So I might eat slowly. I might cut my food up into tiny pieces. I might hide food. I might eat certain things that will overfill me so I can feel much fuller than I actually am. All of these things to
Mm.
try to manage sort of and minimize the sort of impact of that eating. And then as a result of that, I might take a really long time to eat, for example, and then I can convince myself, right, I've had enough, I've done enough, and then I can move on. So you're trying to kind of trick the
Interesting.
brain. Yeah.
So it's just, yeah, so that exactly what I was about to say. So it's just about ways of tricking your brain to almost think you've done it, but you haven't.
Yeah. 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 And constantly preoccupy yourself, constantly busy. So, people with anorexia are, yeah, one of the reasons I really love working with people with eating disorders generally is they're very creative, they're very bright, they're very often very intellectual people, very driven people. So you find really kind of ingenious ways that somebody is kind of managing their life in order to, avoid food, which feels again quite counterintuitive when you don't have that eating problem.
And what about the flip? I'm guessing that the flip side of someone binge eating is just that, we've all had a takeaway on a Sunday night when we're hungover. You feel better in the moment, but then worse in the long run. Is it just that that's essentially what's happening? It's endorphins.
Yeah, I mean, you get a dopamine spike when you have a binge. And again, there's a lot of behavior that goes around that binge. So people might plan that binge. They might feel excited about that binge. They might, allow themselves to eat bad foods or the things that they think they shouldn't be having. So they'll get kind of quite into that. They might go to certain places. They might eat in secret, which can feel quite exhilarating. They might take themselves away from people because it can be very shameful when they're eating sort of huge amounts of food. So it has this whole kind of routine and ritual around it, which then they follow, they get the big dopamine, and then, that crashes. And then what happens is they go into the shame cycle, which is really, really difficult. And the way that they manage the shame is usually to kind of seek the dopamine to pull them back up. So they go and they binge again. So they get this sort of temporary emotional relief followed by this really intense distress.
And how would you suggest, if someone's listening to this that maybe has that disorder, they're binge eating, they're maybe obese or overweight, what would be the first steps to break that cycle?
Well, just out of interest, not everybody with a binge eating disorder is obese or overweight, which is something that we can sometimes fall into a trap of thinking. So you might recognize that you're somebody who does have these sort of cycles of binging. And we don't just binge food, right? We binge Netflix. We're encouraged to, like it's a cool thing to do, right? So we binge lots of things. But when somebody's binging food, one of the things that we invite is, and it's always about pace, is about slowing that down. So kind of bringing it into awareness, exactly in the same way if you're restricting food, sort of just bringing into awareness kind of what is actually happening. So, we deal a lot with reality, like the reality of what is happening. So if you're binging, actually sort of taking a moment just to reflect and think, okay, what have I eaten? Because one of the things people who are binging will often talk about is almost kind of having an out of body experience, like they're kind of quite dissociated during
Mm.
that process. And they don't really want to look at what they've eaten because it's can be quite shaming. They can feel quite embarrassed, they can feel quite horrified, they can feel really frightened. And obviously that kicks off the shame and that kicks off the distress. And then lo and behold, they're binging again. So they're in that sort of cycle. So I think it's really important to sort of slow it down, to sort of acknowledge what's happening. The process of kind of reconnecting into the body. So sometimes people will binge to the point where they are physically sick, not through induced vomiting like in binge in bulimia, but just through the physicality of having had so much food in their body. And being curious about kind of what you're seeking in that process. What is it that you need? People will talk about just wanting to shut everything down, tune everything out. To not feel is often what people are seeking. I just don't want to feel anything. I don't want to think about anything. I often think about, I don't know if you've ever had a small baby and fed a small baby, but you used to sort of say that babies are like milk drunk when they've had a
Mm.
feed and they sort of lie there and they just look sort of incredibly contented and their eyes sort of flutter and their cheeks are sort of squidgy. And it's almost that feeling that people describe sort of seeking when they're in that binging state. I just want to be blissed out. But the binge eating disorder is a lie because you will never get there. In the same way that anorexia is a lie and it will keep lying to you because it will say, well, if you can just weigh 50 kilos, if you can just weigh 40 kilos, if you can just weigh 30 kilos, there's always this other place that you're trying to get to
Mm.
that will feel better, and it's,
E-
tomorrow never comes.
Exactly. Is there a link between neurodivergence and eating disorders?
There's definitely a very high number of people who present in services for eating disorder treatment who also have, it might be people with autism, they might have avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. So whether there's a genetic link, we don't know, but we do know that if you like, they're overrepresented in our population. I think there's lots of thinking around why, the rigidity, the safety, the kind of control, the order in sort of more restrictive illnesses. The very sort of behavioral, functional aspects of an eating disorder can be very reassuring. And also, I think looking at, what often people will talk to me about is they will say, but it's good to have a thin body. It's good to have a healthy body. If I'm thin, it means that I'm successful. It means that I'm more popular.
Mm.
People like me more. Like it's very literal, and you go, "Yep, I get it." It's really hard to argue sometimes. Like it's really very, yeah, that's the reality. It can be quite hard to treat because you're having to sort of really help somebody sort of integrate a different way of understanding that and thinking about that. And often we don't recognize the complexities for somebody with a person with autism, for example, who has an eating disorder. We try to just treat them exactly the same, and we might not understand their sensory needs and the sort of broader issues that need to be thought about. But yeah, it's interesting. We do see an increasing number of people. Yeah.
It's interesting. The reason I ask is that I said at the start, so I'm riddled. I'm literally patient zero when it comes to ADHD, and it drives everyone a bit crazy. But I definitely find myself, along with other people that have that neurodivergence, dopamine hitting on certain things.
Yeah.
So that brings you back up to the baseline where maybe a normal person would sit. So as I understand it, people with ADHD kind of idle just below the baseline. And as a result, what they do is they try and constantly put it back up. And as a result, you get a lot of ADHD people that might smoke or might drink too much, or they have ways of trying to boost that serotonin and, you know, make themselves feel better. And I just wonder if there's a correlation between that and food, because for me, there was definitely, when I was younger, a correlation between that and alcohol. I knew that if I drank, I'd feel better, so I drank a lot. And you know, a lot of people get that with smoking, whatever it might be, but I just wonder if there's a correlation between that and food.
There is. I think it's an interesting one. I think there is also, for sure, there is a correlation between that and food, and particularly with the sort of dopamine seeking sort of behaviors in binge eating disorders. Actually, the kind of highs that somebody might get with something like anorexia, and often the use of exercise, for example. We can get a lot of clients with ADHD who also present with sort of very high levels of exercise in their lives and can become very preoccupied, but often feel that they can't sustain it and those sorts of things. But actually, one of the things I'm really interested in, and we've got we have a really active alumni at Ori, and a lot of clients sort of talk quite openly about this, is where we see people with autism, people with ADHD, what they actually talk about is the bullying that they've experienced, or the feeling like they've been misunderstood in their lives, or they've been punished for, you know, not being able to sit still, or not, you know, being too much, or whatever it might be. And so actually they talk about this kind of chronic invalidation almost. And that's something that seems to become quite quite important for us to hear and for us to listen to, in terms of looking at, okay, how does the eating disorder then develop in terms of protecting or controlling? And that's something when, you know, I think about what then sustains that eating problem for someone. You know, we can say, well, you know, you've got ADHD, so, you know, like sitting in a group for 50 minutes or an hour can feel really sort of overwhelming. It's really difficult. And then we bring people into services. We don't meet, you know, that person's needs because, well, our groups run for an hour and that's just how we do it. And I think, well, we're missing the opportunity to support this person. How about with that person, we walk and talk? You know, clearly, if you've got a BMI of 13, I'm going to have to think about how long we walk for. But, you know, there might be other ways to actually start to engage this person. Maybe we do it through music. Maybe we do it through art. Maybe we do it through having, you know, shorter bite-sized, pardon the pun, sessions. You know, we sort of think about different ways of sort of engaging somebody. And that's how I think we then start to address it. And then we can look at kind of what are the sensory discomforts, or what is feeling out of control in your body, or, you know, what did happen in your bodily changes that made it really difficult for you to be able to regulate that feeling of I need to keep moving, and, you know, et cetera, et cetera.
If you guys enjoyed that clip, please do me a huge favor before you go and head over to our Into the Mind podcast official page, where we have the raw, uncut Into the Mind podcast, and hit that subscribe button. And the more subscribers we get, the more incredible guests we can get on the show. I really appreciate you guys for watching. Thank you so much. And I'll see you all real soon.